What is the most closely guarded secret on Earth? Story 1. In my opinion, one of the most insane closely guarded secrets in history was Ultra, not just because of what it was, but because of how far people went to hide it. It wasn't just a secret, it was basically a global-level deception. Most people know about the German Enigma machine, but what's crazy is that the Allies didn't just crack one system. They ended up breaking almost every major Axis cipher. Enigma, the Japanese Purple cipher, the German Lorenz cipher, even Italian systems like the C-38. And all of that intelligence got funneled into what they called Ultra. This wasn't a small advantage either. This was like having a near real-time window into enemy plans. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because once you break a code, you can't let the other side know. The second they realize, they switch to a new system and you lose everything. So the Allies had to pretend they didn't know, which meant making decisions that looked random, or even wrong, from the outside. They had to create fake reasons for why they acted on certain intel, send out reconnaissance flights just to discover things they already knew. And sometimes, they had to let things happen that they could have stopped, just to protect the bigger secret. That's the part people don't like to talk about. Ultra wasn't just about intelligence. It was about maintaining a lie so big that even your own side couldn't fully know about it. Because if the illusion broke, the advantage disappeared overnight. Story 2. One of the most mysterious and unsettling closely guarded secrets out there is Cicada 3301. Because unlike something like Ultra, this isn't a confirmed government operation with a clear purpose. It's something that just appeared and then disappeared, leaving almost no solid answers behind. Back in 2012, a strange post showed up online claiming to be looking for highly intelligent individuals. Nothing unusual at first, until people started digging into it. What followed was one of the most complex puzzle trails ever created. We're talking layers of cryptography, steganography, obscure literature, philosophy, ancient texts, and even real-world clues hidden across multiple countries. People had to decode images, analyze sound files, use advanced math, and physically travel to locations where QR codes were hidden in public places. This wasn't some random internet puzzle. This was something built by people who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. And the weirdest part is what happened next. Some people actually solved parts of it. They got further than anyone expected. And then, they just vanished from the public discussion. No updates, no explanations, nothing. Cicada 3301 ran for a few years, dropping new puzzles each time, and then just stopped. No official reveal. No confirmation of who was behind it. No clear purpose. Some think it was a recruitment tool for intelligence agencies. Others think it was a private group looking for extremely specific types of thinkers. Some even believe it was something more obscure or philosophical. But whatever it was, it showed one thing very clearly. There are people out there capable of creating something incredibly complex, incredibly coordinated, and then disappearing without a trace. Story 3. Ancient China's silk production. Not because it was mysterious in a creepy way, but because they managed to guard it for thousands of years, which is honestly insane when you think about how valuable it was. For a long time, silk was basically one of the most desirable materials on Earth. It was lightweight, incredibly strong, smooth, and unlike anything people in Europe or the Middle East had ever seen. Entire trade routes, like the Silk Road, were built around it. But here's the crazy part. No one outside China knew how it was made. People had theories. Some thought it came from plants. Others imagined it was some kind of magical fabric or special process. But the actual truth, that silk came from silkworm cocoons, was kept tightly controlled. The Chinese guarded this secret so seriously that exporting silkworms or revealing the process was punishable by death. And somehow, it worked. For nearly 3,000 years, no one managed to successfully replicate it. Eventually, the secret did leak. Legend says a Chinese princess smuggled silkworm eggs out hidden in her hair when she was sent to marry a foreign ruler. But by then, China had already dominated the silk trade for centuries. What makes this so wild isn't just the secrecy, it's the consistency. Empires rose and fell, trade expanded, cultures mixed, and yet that one secret stayed locked down for generations. No leaks, no accidental spread, nothing. In a world where information eventually slips out, they managed to hold on to something incredibly valuable for longer than most civilizations even lasted. Story 4. The most quietly terrifying secrets isn't something we know for sure exists. It's something that might exist and would never be confirmed. Anti-nuclear technology. Because if either side during the Cold War, the USA or the USSR, had a reliable way to neutralize incoming nuclear weapons, there is absolutely no scenario where they would openly admit it. The entire balance of that era was built on mutually assured destruction, MAD. The idea was simple and brutal. If you launch nukes, you get nuked back. Nobody wins. That fear alone prevented direct war between superpowers. But imagine if one side quietly figured out how to stop incoming missiles. Suddenly, the whole balance breaks. If you can defend yourself from retaliation, then nuclear weapons stop being a deterrent and start becoming a one-sided advantage. And that's exactly why, if such a system ever existed, or even came close to working, it would be buried as deep as possible. No announcements, no proof, just silence. There were always rumors, missile defense systems, experimental interception tech, early versions of what later became programs like Strategic Defense Initiative, but nothing ever publicly reached the level where nukes became irrelevant. And maybe that's the point, because even hinting that you could stop nuclear retaliation might force the other side to escalate faster, build more weapons, or assume the worst. So, if something like that ever worked, the smartest move wouldn't be to show it off. It would be to let the world keep believing that nuclear war is unwinnable, because the moment that belief disappears, everything changes. Story 5. I honestly think we haven't seen a quarter of the high-tech stuff the US military has created. I kind of agree with this, and not in a tinfoil hat way, just in a this is how governments actually work kind of way, because if you look at history, the pattern is pretty consistent. Stuff that sounds insane or futuristic usually ends up being real, just years before anyone outside knew it existed. Like stealth aircraft are the perfect example. The F-117 Nighthawk was flying in the late 70s and early 80s, and people didn't even know it was a real thing until it was basically already operational, and that wasn't some minor upgrade. That was a completely new way of thinking about aircraft design. Same with reconnaissance tech, satellites, early cyber capabilities. All of it existed in some form long before it became public, and by the time people hear about it, it's usually already outdated, or at least no longer the cutting edge. And then you've got agencies like DARPA, whose entire job is literally to build the future before anyone else even realizes it's possible. And they're not doing that out in the open. They're doing it years ahead of time and only showing parts of it when it's no longer a strategic advantage to hide it. So, yeah, I don't think it's crazy to say we haven't seen a quarter of it, because there's no incentive to show it. If anything, the incentive is to show less than what you actually have, or even let people underestimate you completely. It's probably not, we have sci-fi alien weapons, but more like there's a layer of tech that's quietly way more advanced than what's public, and we only ever see it once it's either safe to reveal or already been replaced by something better. Story 6. The idea of using seawater as a fuel sounds almost unreal, but the more you think about it, the more it feels like something that should exist already, because the ocean is basically an endless chemical reservoir just sitting there, and we already know there is energy locked inside it. The interesting part is that we're not completely in the dark about it either. Extracting hydrogen from water is already possible, and hydrogen itself is a clean fuel. The problem is just that right now the process is inefficient, meaning you spend more energy pulling it out than you actually get back from using it. But that's a very specific limitation. It's not that it can't work, it's that it doesn't work well enough yet. And if that one barrier ever gets solved in a big way, it wouldn't just be another energy breakthrough. It would completely change how power works globally, because suddenly energy isn't tied to location, resources, or supply chains anymore. It's just everywhere. At that point, you're not just talking about science, you're talking about control. Who develops it, who scales it, who decides when it becomes public, all of that matters way more than the discovery itself. Because once something like that is fully out, it levels the playing field in a way that a lot of existing systems are built to prevent. So, if a version of that tech ever did exist that actually works at scale, it wouldn't be surprising at all if it stayed quiet for a while, not forever, but long enough for whoever has it to figure out how to use that advantage before everyone else catches up. Story 7. Atlantis is one of those stories that refuses to die, not because there's solid proof, but because the idea of an advanced civilization just disappearing into the ocean hits something deep. The original story comes from Plato, who described Atlantis as a powerful, highly advanced society that existed thousands of years before his time, and then got wiped out in a single catastrophic event, sinking beneath the sea almost overnight. And ever since then, people have been trying to figure out if he was talking about a real place or just using it as a metaphor. What makes it interesting is that there are real events that kind of line up with the story, like the massive volcanic eruption on Santorini, which destroyed parts of the Minoan civilization and likely caused huge tsunamis across the region. So it's not hard to imagine that a disaster like that could have been passed down and exaggerated over time into something like Atlantis. But then you've also got people who take it way further, talking about a lost super advanced civilization, technology ahead of its time, entire cities still sitting somewhere deep underwater waiting to be found. The reality is probably somewhere in between. Not some futuristic underwater empire, but maybe a real place that got destroyed so completely that all that survived was the story. And that's what keeps it alive. Because the ocean is massive, mostly unexplored, and it's one of the few places left on Earth where something huge could still be hidden well enough that we just haven't stumbled onto it yet. Story 8. Launch codes are one of those things that feel almost mythical, but they're actually very real, and probably one of the most tightly controlled secrets on Earth. The idea sounds simple on the surface, codes that allow a country to launch nuclear weapons. But in reality, it's not just a single code or button. It's an entire system designed to prevent mistakes, unauthorized use, or someone going rogue. In the US, for example, the president carries what's known as the nuclear football, which contains the tools needed to authorize a launch, along with identity verification tied to something called the gold codes. These codes are used to confirm that the order is legitimate before anything even begins. And even after that, it's not like one person just presses a button. There are multiple layers of verification, multiple people involved, and strict protocols that require confirmation at every step. Because once that process starts, there's no taking it back. What makes it interesting is how much of it is known in general terms, but the actual details, how the codes are generated, how they're changed, how they're secured, the exact procedures, are completely classified. And they have to be. Because if that system is ever compromised, it's not just a leak, it's potentially catastrophic on a global level. There's also this weird balance where the system has to be secure enough that no one can break into it, but also fast enough to work under extreme pressure if it ever had to be used. So, unlike a lot of secrets that are about hidden discoveries or unknown tech, launch codes are scary in a different way. They're not mysterious because we don't know they exist. They're mysterious because of how much we don't know about how they actually work. And probably never will. Story 9, the nuclear briefcase, often called the nuclear football, is one of those things that sounds like pure movie fiction. But it's actually very real, and honestly way more unsettling when you realize how it works. In the US, it's a briefcase that follows the president literally everywhere, carried by a military aide, and inside it isn't a big red button or anything dramatic like that. It's more like a mobile command system that allows the president to authorize a nuclear strike from basically anywhere. It contains things like communication equipment, pre-planned strike options, and authentication materials, including the famous ID codes, sometimes referred to as the biscuit, that verify the president's identity before any order can be carried out. What makes it crazy isn't just that it exists, it's how normal it becomes in that environment. Wherever the president goes, it goes. Meetings, travel, public appearances, it's always nearby, just quietly existing in the background, as this constant reminder that the ability to launch nuclear weapons is never far away. And just like launch codes, it's not as simple as one person opening it and pressing a button. There are multiple layers of confirmation, military chains of command, and strict procedures involved. But at the end of the day, that briefcase represents something pretty heavy. The fact that in certain situations, decisions with global consequences could be initiated from something that looks like a regular black case sitting a few feet away. And the real details, what's exactly inside, how it's structured, how the process fully works, are still mostly classified, which just adds to how surreal the whole thing is. Story 10. The Vatican Vault is one of those things that sounds like it should contain something insane, like forbidden knowledge, ancient artifacts, or documents that could rewrite history overnight. But the reality is both less dramatic and somehow still just as intriguing. What people usually mean is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Secret Archives. And despite the name, secret originally just meant private, not hidden from existence, just restricted. That said, it is still one of the most controlled collections of documents on Earth. We're talking about miles of shelving filled with centuries of records, letters from kings and emperors, official church documents, diplomatic correspondence, trial records, and handwritten notes from some of the most important figures in history. There are documents linked to events like the trial of Galileo Galilei, letters from Michelangelo, and communications involving major historical conflicts and political decisions. So, it's not full of magical artifacts or hidden alien tech. It's something arguably more powerful: information. Original, unfiltered records of history as it happened, written by the people who were actually involved. And the reason it feels so mysterious is because access is extremely limited. Scholars can apply to study specific materials, but they don't get free roam, and a lot of documents haven't been fully explored or made public yet. Which naturally leads to speculation. People imagine lost gospels, suppressed knowledge, controversial records that could challenge established narratives. Maybe some of that exists, maybe not. But the truth is, when you have over 1,000 years of tightly controlled documentation, there are bound to be things in there that very few people have ever seen. And that alone is enough to keep the mystery alive. Story 11. Area 51 and Hangar 18 are like the perfect mix of real secrecy and people filling in the blanks with imagination. Area 51 is 100% real. It's a highly classified U.S. Air Force facility out in Nevada, and we know it's been used for testing advanced aircraft for decades. Stuff like the U-2 spy plane and stealth tech that the public didn't know about until years later. So, the secrecy part is legit. But that's also exactly why it turned into this massive mystery, because when you combine real classified projects with zero transparency, people start connecting dots that may or may not exist, which is how you end up with theories about alien spacecraft, reverse engineering, and all kinds of hidden tech. Then there's Hangar 18, which gets talked about as this ultra-secret storage site for extraterrestrial materials, usually tied to Roswell-type stories. But, unlike Area 51, there's way less solid evidence it's anything special beyond a normal military facility. It's more legend than confirmed reality. And then you've got something completely different, like the caramilk chocolate bar, Secret, which is honestly funny because it's basically a marketing mystery about how they get the caramel inside the chocolate without breaking it. And people have joked about it like it's some kind of classified formula. But in a weird way, it fits the same pattern. Something hidden, something controlled, something people aren't fully told about, and that gap just gets filled with speculation. Whether it's advanced aircraft, alien theories, or chocolate manufacturing, the moment information is restricted, people assume there's something bigger behind it. Sometimes they're right. Most of the time, it's just a really well-kept process. Story 12. This is one of those ideas that feels like it should be true, because the stakes are so massive. Like if there really was a simple, scalable way to run everything on something as abundant as water, you're not just talking about a new invention, you're talking about completely rewriting the global economy overnight. Oil, gas, energy infrastructure, entire industries, all of that would take a hit. And yeah, companies built around that wouldn't exactly be excited about losing that kind of power and influence. But the part that usually gets misunderstood is the cars running on water idea. Water itself isn't a fuel, it's more like what you get after fuel has already been used. So to get energy from it, you have to put energy in first, usually to split it into hydrogen and oxygen. And that process is where the problem is, because right now it takes more energy than you get back, so it doesn't really work as a net energy source. That's why those stories about water-powered cars tend to fall apart under scrutiny, not because they're being hidden, but because they don't actually break that energy balance in a practical way. That said, the broader point still holds some weight. Energy transitions don't happen instantly, even when better tech exists, because there's so much money, infrastructure, and influence tied to existing systems. So new energy solutions often get slowed down, controlled, or rolled out gradually rather than flipping everything overnight. So it's less like there's a fully working water engine being hidden somewhere, and more like any real breakthrough would be managed very carefully, because whoever controls energy doesn't just control a market, they control a huge part of how the world runs. Story 13. How life came to exist on Earth is probably the biggest real secret we don't actually have the answer to. And what's interesting is that it's not hidden on purpose like Area 51 or classified tech. It's just something we genuinely haven't fully figured out yet. Scientists have solid pieces of the puzzle, but not the full picture. The most accepted idea is something called abiogenesis, which is basically the idea that life formed naturally from non-living chemicals billions of years ago, when early Earth had a very different environment, lots of heat, volcanic activity, lightning, and a mix of simple molecules floating around. At some point, those molecules started forming more complex structures, things like amino acids, then eventually self-replicating molecules like RNA. And from there, life slowly built itself up over an insane amount of time. There have been experiments showing parts of this are possible, like the famous Miller-Urey experiment, where scientists recreated early Earth conditions and ended up forming organic compounds. But here's the catch. We don't know the exact moment where chemistry turned into biology. That transition from non-living matter to something that can replicate, evolve, and sustain itself is still a mystery. There are other theories too, like life starting near deep-sea hydrothermal vents, or even the idea that basic building blocks came from space on meteorites. But none of them fully explain everything yet. So, unlike a lot of secrets people talk about, this isn't something being hidden or covered up. It's something humanity is still trying to figure out. And in a weird way, that makes it even more interesting because it means one of the most fundamental questions about existence is still wide open. Story 14. Visits from extraterrestrials is one of those secrets that sits right on the edge between curiosity and speculation, because unlike something like ultra or silk production, there's no confirmed proof, but there's just enough weird data to keep the idea alive. You've got decades of reports, military sightings, radar anomalies, pilot testimonies, and now what people call UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, being openly acknowledged by governments, especially the US, which already makes it feel less like pure conspiracy and more like something is going on, we just don't know what. There have been official releases, like Navy pilots tracking objects that move in ways that don't match known aircraft, no visible propulsion, insane acceleration, hovering, then gone in seconds, and even the Pentagon admitting that some of these things are still unexplained. But unexplained doesn't automatically mean alien. It could be advanced human tech, sensor errors, atmospheric effects, or something we just don't fully understand yet. The leap to extraterrestrial visits is where things get speculative, because if that were confirmed, it wouldn't just be another discovery, it would be the biggest shift in human history. Scientifically, culturally, politically, everything changes overnight. And that's why people think if it were real, it might be kept quiet. Not necessarily hidden forever, but controlled, studied, understood before being fully revealed. Still, as of now, there's no solid verified evidence that extraterrestrials have actually visited Earth. Just a mix of credible mysteries, incomplete data, and a lot of imagination filling in the gaps. Which is exactly why the idea never really goes away. Story 15. The Ark of the Covenant is one of those artifacts that sits right in that space between history, religion, and mystery. And the fact that no one knows where it is just makes it even more fascinating. According to the Bible, the Ark was a sacred chest built to hold the Ten Commandments. And it wasn't just symbolic, it was described as something incredibly powerful, almost dangerous, like it represented a direct connection between God and the people of Israel. It shows up a lot in ancient texts, especially during battles and major events, and then at some point, it just disappears. The most common theory is that it was lost or destroyed during the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, around 587 BC, when the first temple of Jerusalem was destroyed. but there's no clear record confirming what actually happened to it. And that's where all the theories start. Some believe it was hidden somewhere beneath Jerusalem before the invasion. Others say it was taken to Ethiopia, where it's supposedly kept in a church and guarded so closely that almost no one is allowed to see it. There are even ideas that it was moved multiple times and is still hidden somewhere today. What makes it so compelling is that it's not just a lost object. It's tied to thousands of years of belief, meaning, and power. So, whether it was destroyed, hidden, or is still out there somewhere, the Ark isn't just a historical mystery. It's one of those things where the story itself is almost as powerful as the possibility that it might still exist. Story 16. There really are underground areas beneath the United States Capitol, and Capitol Hill in general, but they're not hidden in the sense of secret vaults with unknown contents. They're more like a mix of infrastructure, history, and a bit of restricted access that naturally fuels curiosity. Underneath the Capitol, there are tunnels, corridors, storage spaces, and even transit systems that connect buildings like the House and Senate offices. Lawmakers actually use small underground trains to move between buildings quickly, which most people don't realize exists. There are also older, less used spaces, basements, former utility areas, and sections that date back to earlier construction phases, which gives the whole thing that layered, almost maze-like feel. And then there's the security side. After events like the Cold War, there were definitely continuity of government plans, meaning certain protected or hardened spaces were designed in case of emergencies, but the exact details of those are obviously not public. Story 17. That's one of those ideas that sounds super believable at first, especially because the stakes are so huge, like if there really were cancer cures or life extension drugs that add 50+ years. That wouldn't just be a medical breakthrough, it would completely reshape society, economics, population, everything. But the reality is a bit different, and honestly more complicated than a single hidden cure. Cancer isn't one disease, it's hundreds of different diseases, all with different causes, mutations, and behaviors, which is why there isn't one universal cure sitting somewhere that fixes all of it. What has been happening, though, is a slow, steady wave of progress. Things like immunotherapy, targeted therapies, and personalized medicine that are getting better every year. Same with life extension. There's active research into aging, stuff like cellular repair, senescence, gene editing, but nothing remotely close to add 50 years overnight exists yet in any verified, scalable way. And here's the key part people often miss. If a real working cure or massive life extension drug existed, it wouldn't make sense to hide it completely because it would be worth trillions. Whoever had it could dominate the entire global medical industry overnight just by releasing it. That doesn't mean everything is transparent, though. Story 18. The formulas for Coca-Cola and Pepsi are probably some of the most famous real secrets in the world. Not mysterious in a sci-fi way, but in a very controlled corporate kind of way that's actually been maintained for over a century. With Coca-Cola especially, the story is kind of legendary. The original formula, often referred to as Merchandise 7X, is supposedly known by only a handful of people at any given time, and it's said to be locked away in a secure vault at the World of Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta. And whether or not every detail of that story is exactly true, the important part is this. They've successfully kept the exact recipe hidden long enough that it became part of the brand itself. Because at this point, the secrecy is just as valuable as the drink. Pepsi is a bit less theatrical about it, but the same idea applies. The exact formulation, flavor balance, and production process are tightly controlled and protected as trade secrets. What's interesting is that it's not like people haven't tried to reverse engineer them. They absolutely have. There are close enough versions, lab analyses, guesses at the ingredients, but the exact ratios, sourcing, and processing details are what really matter, and those are what companies protect the most. And unlike government secrets or conspiracy theories, this is one of those cases where the secrecy actually makes perfect sense. Because if you've built a global brand worth billions on a specific formula, keeping that formula locked down isn't mysterious. It's just good business. Story 19. The Mariana's Web is one of those internet ideas that sounds insanely cool and mysterious, like some hidden layer of the internet deeper than the dark web. But when you actually dig into it, it's more myth than reality. The concept usually gets described as this ultra-secret part of the internet that you can't access with normal tools like Tor, supposedly requiring quantum computers, special encryption, or even AI to get into. And people say it contains things like classified data, hidden knowledge, or stuff governments don't want anyone to see. The problem is, there's no real evidence it exists. Unlike the dark web, which is very real and accessible through tools like Tor, the Mariana's web doesn't have any confirmed infrastructure, no verified entry points, no actual documented content. Nothing you can point to and say, this is it. It mostly started as a concept on forums and videos, and then grew because it taps into that same idea people love, that there's always something deeper, something more hidden, something just out of reach. And the name itself is perfect for that. It's clearly inspired by the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, so it gives that feeling of, this is the deepest layer of the internet, even if it's just metaphorical. In reality, the internet doesn't really have infinite hidden layers like that. Story 20. The Bilderberg meeting is one of those things that feels like it should be a conspiracy, but is actually just very private, which is enough to make people suspicious. It's a real annual conference that's been happening since the 1950s, where a few hundred people get invited. Usually a mix of politicians, CEOs, bankers, military leaders, academics. Basically people with a lot of influence. No press, no live streams, no official transcripts. And that's the part that gets people. Because in a world where almost everything is documented, recorded, and public, you've got this high-level gathering of powerful people happening behind closed doors, with almost no visibility into what's actually being said. Now, officially, the reason for that is something called the Chatham House Rule, which basically means people are allowed to use the information discussed, but they can't reveal who said what. So it's supposed to encourage more honest, open conversations without political pressure or media spin. So, on paper, it's not about secret decisions, it's about off-the-record discussion. But from the outside, it looks very different. You've got world leaders, major corporations, and financial powerhouses all in one place, talking privately, and then going back out into the world where they influence policy, markets, and global decisions. So, even if nothing officially binding happens there, the idea that conversations at that level don't have some impact is hard to believe. And that's why it stays in that weird space. Story 21, 100% efficient energy conversion, is one of those ideas that sounds like the ultimate hidden breakthrough. Like, if someone cracked it, they'd basically unlock infinite usable energy with zero waste, no heat loss, no inefficiency, just pure conversion from one form to another. But the reason it feels like a secret is because it runs straight into one of the most fundamental limits in physics. The second law of thermodynamics basically says you always lose some energy, usually as heat. Whenever you convert energy from one form to another, there's no system that's perfectly efficient. So, in theory, true 100% efficiency isn't just undiscovered, it's considered impossible. That said, we do get really close in specific cases. Some systems, like certain electrical components or superconductors under extreme conditions, can approach near-perfect efficiency, and modern tech keeps pushing that limit higher and higher, just never fully reaching it. And that's where the idea gets interesting, because even getting from, say, 90% to 99.9% efficiency in a major system would be a massive breakthrough, like world-changing levels of impact without technically breaking physics. So, it's not that there's some hidden 100% efficiency machine being kept secret. It's more that the closer you get to that limit, the more valuable and controlled that technology becomes. And if anything ever did appear to hit 100%, it wouldn't just be a secret. It would mean we fundamentally misunderstood how the universe works. Story 22. Tesla's radiant energy is one of those ideas that sits right on the edge between real science and what could have been. And that's why it keeps coming back up. Nikola Tesla was definitely working on some wild concepts for his time, especially around wireless energy transmission and tapping into natural energy sources, and projects like the Wardenclyffe Tower were meant to transmit power through the Earth or atmosphere without wires, which already sounds crazy even today. The whole radiant energy idea usually comes from Tesla talking about capturing energy from the environment, like ambient electromagnetic radiation, solar energy, or even differences in electrical potential in the atmosphere, so there is a real foundation there. But the leap to free unlimited energy for the entire planet is where things get more speculative. Because while there is energy all around us, the key issue is density and efficiency. Just like with seawater hydrogen, there's energy present, but extracting it in a way that gives you more usable output than input is the hard part. Tesla believed it could be done, and he definitely pushed the ideas way ahead of his time. But there's no verified system he built that actually delivered unlimited free energy at scale. And then there's the other layer, the idea that it was suppressed. It's true his later projects lost funding and support, especially when they didn't show immediate commercial viability, but that's also pretty common for experimental tech that doesn't clearly pay off in the short term. So it's less like a fully working free energy system was buried, and more like Tesla was exploring concepts that were partially right, partially ahead of available technology, and partially unrealistic in execution. Still, the reason people keep bringing it up is simple. The idea of pulling usable energy from the environment without limits is one of the most powerful concepts you can imagine, and Tesla was one of the few people bold enough to seriously chase it. Story 23, that sounds like one of those ideas that hits in a really unsettling way, like instead of secrets being hidden for power or money, they're hidden because knowing them would actually be worse than not knowing. The robots protecting us angle makes it feel less like a conspiracy and more like a containment system. Like something already went wrong or was discovered, and now the goal isn't control, it's damage control. In that version, technology isn't just advancing for convenience or efficiency, it's acting like a buffer between us and something we're not meant to fully see yet. And the scary part is how subtle that would be. Not obvious guards or restrictions, just layers of systems guiding what we access, what we focus on, what we ignore, shaping reality in a way that feels natural, but keeps certain things just out of reach. So the secret isn't locked in a vault somewhere, it's just never fully shown, filtered, redirected, softened. And the idea behind it isn't that people are being controlled, it's that people are being protected from something they wouldn't handle well, which flips the whole concept, because now the question isn't about who's hiding the truth, it's about whether the truth itself is the problem. Story 24. What lives down there is honestly less giant monster and more things that shouldn't logically survive, but do anyway. At the bottom of places like the Mariana Trench, you're dealing with crushing pressure, near freezing temperatures, and total darkness. Basically one of the most extreme environments on Earth. And yet, life is still there. You've got creatures like snailfish, which look soft and almost fragile, but are perfectly adapted to insane pressure. Their bodies don't have rigid structures that would collapse, and their cells are built to function where most life would instantly fail. Then there are amphipods, kind of like deep-sea shrimp, except some of them grow surprisingly large and are among the dominant scavengers down there, feeding on whatever organic material sinks from above. You also get things like xenophyophores, which are giant single-celled organisms, some of the largest single cells on Earth, just sitting on the seafloor collecting particles. And bacteria, lots of it. Microbial life is everywhere down there, forming the base of the entire ecosystem, surviving off chemical processes instead of sunlight. What's interesting is that everything down there is built for efficiency and survival, not speed or aggression. No giant predators ruling the trench, just slow, adapted life forms, making the most out of almost nothing. And the deeper you go, the less we actually know. We've explored very little of these zones, so while we haven't found anything truly monstrous, the reality is we've barely scratched the surface. Story 25, that's one of those, if it were true, everything changes instantly kind of secrets. Because confirmed alien life, whether it's visitors here or even just microbes on Mars, wouldn't be some niche discovery, it would completely flip our understanding of life, biology, and our place in the universe overnight. Right now, there's no verified proof that extraterrestrial life has visited Earth. There are a lot of reports, sightings, military footage, and unexplained aerial phenomena, but none of it has been confirmed as alien in origin. It's all in that gray zone of, we don't know what this is, which is very different from, we know it's extraterrestrial. Mars is a bit more grounded. Missions from agencies like NASA have found strong evidence that Mars used to have conditions suitable for life. things like ancient riverbeds, minerals formed in water, and organic molecules. So, the possibility that microbial life existed there at some point is very real. But again, no confirmed discovery of actual life yet. Now, if something like that were found, especially simple life on Mars, it probably wouldn't be hidden for long because it would be one of the biggest scientific discoveries in history, and scientists worldwide would be involved in verifying it. That said, information like that could be handled carefully at first. Not hidden forever, but studied, confirmed, and prepared before being fully announced, just to avoid misinformation or premature conclusions. So, it's less like there's confirmed alien life being secretly kept from everyone, and more like we're at the edge of possibly discovering it, but haven't crossed that line yet. And once we do, it won't stay quiet for long. Story 26. That one's interesting because it sounds like a hidden truth, but it's actually kind of out in the open once you look at it closely. The Cold War as an official conflict between the US and the Soviet Union definitely ended, but the underlying behavior never really went away. It just changed form. Countries are still building weapons, modernizing arsenals, and investing heavily in military tech, especially nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, AI systems, hypersonic missiles. All of it is still very active, just less visible to the average person. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction didn't disappear either. Nuclear deterrence is still a thing, meaning the logic is basically the same. Nobody launches because everyone knows what would happen if they did. It's just quieter now. Less obvious propaganda, fewer public drills, not the same constant fear in everyday life, but behind the scenes, the systems are still there, being maintained and upgraded. And in some ways, it's even more complex now. Instead of just two superpowers, you've got multiple countries with nuclear capabilities, shifting alliances, and new types of warfare layered on top of the old ones. So, it's not really that the Cold War never ended, it's more like it evolved. The tension didn't disappear, it just stopped being as visible. Which almost makes it feel more unsettling because it's still happening, just without everyone constantly talking about it. Story 27, that one feels like a secret because of how it's talked about, but it's really more of a difficult reality than something being hidden. We're not out of time in the sense that nothing can be done anymore, but we are past the point where climate change can be completely stopped or reversed. A lot of the effects are already set in motion: rising temperatures, melting ice, sea level rise, and shifts in weather patterns that will continue even if emissions drop sharply. So, the goal has shifted. It's no longer about preventing change entirely, it's about limiting how severe the outcomes become. That's where the urgency comes from. Every delay makes future impacts worse, but every improvement still has value. It's not an all-or-nothing situation, where everything is either saved or lost. What makes it feel confusing is how it's communicated. Some people interpret the situation as already hopeless, while others act like it's not a serious issue at all. The reality sits in between those extremes. We've already altered the system in a meaningful way, but we still have control over how far those changes go. Story 28, that's one of those takes that feels less like a secret and more like something people slowly realize the deeper they look into how markets actually work. The system isn't necessarily rigged in a simple, obvious way, like someone flipping a switch and deciding who wins. But it is built in a way where people with more information, better tools, and faster execution have a massive advantage over everyday investors. You've got things like high-frequency trading, institutional access to data, complex financial instruments, and entire teams analyzing markets in real time. And that creates a gap that's hard to compete with if you're just an individual investing from your phone. And then there's the regulatory side. Agencies like the US Securities and Exchange Commission are supposed to enforce fairness and transparency, but critics argue that enforcement can be inconsistent, penalties sometimes aren't strong enough to deter large players, and there's always that concern about close relationships between regulators and the industries they oversee. That doesn't mean the entire system is a scam, or that everyday investors can't succeed. Plenty of people do over the long term, especially with simple strategies. But it does mean the playing field isn't perfectly even. It's more like a system where the rules are public, but the advantages are layered, and the deeper you go, the more you realize how much infrastructure and influence sits behind the scenes. So it's less of a hidden conspiracy and more of a structural imbalance that becomes more obvious the more you understand how everything operates. Story 29. That idea comes up a lot because from the outside it really does look like they age differently and live longer than most people, but it's not really some hidden secret or special cure. It's more about the kind of advantages they have had their entire lives. The British royal family has access to top-tier medical care at all times, not just when something goes wrong, but constantly, with regular monitoring and early detection, which makes a huge difference because a lot of serious illnesses become far more treatable when caught early. On top of that, their lifestyle is very controlled compared to the average person. They don't deal with financial stress. They have access to high-quality nutrition, structured routines, and the ability to prioritize their health without distractions. And over decades, that adds up in a way that's hard to replicate. It's also worth pointing out that they're not immune to illness at all. For example, King Charles III has been publicly reported to be dealing with cancer, which shows that they face the same biological risks as anyone else. What creates the illusion is that we mostly see the outcomes, not the full picture. And when people consistently have better health care, better conditions, and early intervention, they tend to live longer and appear healthier, which can make it feel like there's something hidden behind it, when it's really just a long-term advantage playing out over time. Story 30, that take gets thrown around a lot, and it's partly true, but also kind of oversimplified depending on what part of crypto you're talking about. The environmental criticism mainly comes from proof-of-work systems like Bitcoin, where mining requires a huge amount of computational power, and therefore electricity, which in some cases has been comparable to the energy usage of entire countries. That's where most of the crypto is terrible for the environment argument comes from, and it's a valid concern. But not all crypto works like that. Some newer systems use proof of stake, which cuts energy usage drastically because it doesn't rely on massive mining operations. For example, Ethereum switched from proof of work to proof of stake, and its energy consumption dropped massively as a result. So, it's not really a single category where everything is equally bad. As for being unviable, that depends on how you define it. Crypto has clear limitations, price volatility, regulatory uncertainty, and real-world usability issues. But it also has use cases like decentralized finance, cross-border transfers, and programmable contracts that traditional systems don't handle as easily. The bigger picture is that it's still evolving. Some parts of it are inefficient or overhyped, some parts are improving, and some parts might not last long-term. So, it's less like a hidden truth that crypto is bad and doomed, and more like a technology that has real trade-offs, where certain versions are environmentally costly, while others are trying to solve that exact problem. Story 31, that one isn't really a hidden secret. It's more like something people know exists but don't fully grasp the scale of. Modern governments collect and analyze a huge amount of data, not just through intelligence agencies, but through a mix of public records, legal surveillance, partnerships with companies, and digital infrastructure that people interact with every day. You've got things like financial data, travel records, communication metadata, online activity in certain cases, and all of that can be aggregated, cross-referenced, and analyzed in ways that weren't possible even a couple decades ago. Agencies like the National Security Agency became widely discussed after leaks showed how large-scale data collection programs were being used, and that gave people a glimpse into how extensive some of these systems can be. But it's not just one country. Most governments with the capability are doing some version of this, especially when it comes to national security, law enforcement, and intelligence gathering. What makes it feel unsettling is not just the amount of data, but what can be done with it. Patterns can be identified, networks mapped, behavior predicted to some extent, and all of that happens mostly in the background, without people actively thinking about it. At the same time, there are laws, oversight systems, and limits that vary by country, so it's not a completely unchecked system everywhere, even though debates about privacy versus security are ongoing. So it's less about a single hidden database with everything about everyone, and more about how much information exists in pieces, and how powerful it becomes when those pieces are connected and analyzed together. Story 32. That idea hits because it taps into something really human, the feeling that there's a hidden timeline somewhere, like someone knows how everything ends and just isn't telling anyone. But in reality, there isn't a single end date sitting in a vault that governments or elites are hiding. What does exist is a lot of risk assessment and forecasting. Governments, scientists, and institutions constantly model things like climate scenarios, economic collapse risks, pandemics, geopolitical conflicts, all the ways things could go wrong. Some of those projections are pretty grim depending on the assumptions, and not all of them get widely communicated in detail because they're uncertain, complex, or could cause panic if misunderstood. So it can feel like they know something we don't, when really it's more like they know possibilities, not certainties. There's no single switch where everything suddenly ends. It's not a movie-style scenario where someone has the exact moment written down. It's more like overlapping risks that could escalate depending on how things play out. And the reason it feels like a secret is because uncertainty isn't satisfying. People want a clear answer, a date, a definitive outcome, but the reality is messier than that. There are trends, probabilities, and warning signs, but no confirmed endpoint being hidden away. So it's less about a secret being kept, and more about the fact that the future isn't fully predictable, even for the people studying it the most. Story 33. That one is actually closer to reality than most people think, just not in the hidden forever sense, more like things that only became known years or decades later. There have been multiple moments where the world got uncomfortably close to something catastrophic, especially during the Cold War, and most people had no idea at the time. One of the most famous examples is Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet officer who in 1983 was monitoring early warning systems when they reported incoming US nuclear missiles, and everything in protocol said he should report it as a real attack, which could have triggered retaliation, but he hesitated, trusted his instincts, and it turned out to be a false alarm. Another one is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which people know about, but what's less talked about is how close it got behind the scenes, including a Soviet submarine that was nearly authorized to launch a nuclear torpedo before one officer refused. There are also incidents involving lost nuclear weapons, radar errors, misinterpreted signals, and technical glitches that could have escalated if handled slightly differently. The key pattern is this: most of these weren't covered up forever. They were just not public at the time, either because of classification, panic prevention, or political reasons, and only came out later through declassified documents or first-hand accounts. So it's not like there's a hidden list of near apocalypses no one will ever know about. But it is true that we've had multiple close calls, and the world often only finds out long after the fact, which is honestly more unsettling in a quiet way because it shows how much has depended on human judgment, chance, and a few people making the right call under pressure. Story 34. There is massive money and influence operating at levels most people never directly see. Global finance, multinational corporations, sovereign wealth funds, institutional investors, all moving amounts of capital that are hard to even wrap your head around. Decisions made in those spaces absolutely influence markets, policy directions, and even geopolitical relationships. And governments don't exist in isolation from that. They interact with those systems constantly through regulation, lobbying, trade, debt, and economic policy. So, influence definitely flows both ways. Wealthy individuals and large organizations can shape outcomes, sometimes significantly, but saying governments are just pawns oversimplifies it. Governments still hold real power, laws, military, taxation, regulation, and they can push back, break up companies, impose restrictions, or shift entire industries when they choose to. It's more of a tension than a one-way control system. What's actually happening is more complex. You've got overlapping layers of power, political, economic, institutional, all interacting, sometimes aligned, sometimes competing. Big money can influence governments, and governments can influence big money. So it's less like there's one hidden group pulling all the strings, and more like there's a network of power centers. Some visible, some less visible, all shaping outcomes in different ways. And because most of that happens behind the scenes, or in complex systems, it can feel like something bigger and more controlled than it actually is, even though the reality is more fragmented and messy than a single hidden authority. Story 35. That one feels less like a hidden secret and more like something people gradually notice the more they pay attention to how large systems actually function. Corruption definitely exists. In some places it's blatant. In others it's more subtle, things like lobbying, conflicts of interest, revolving doors between industries and regulators, decisions that benefit certain groups more than the public. It's not evenly spread, but it's real enough that people see patterns and lose trust. But what surprises a lot of people even more isn't corruption, it's incompetence. Huge institutions, whether governments or corporations, are made up of layers of people, bureaucracy, communication gaps, outdated systems, and competing priorities. Decisions get delayed, misunderstood, or executed poorly not because of some master plan, but because complexity creates friction everywhere. Story 36. The full extent of how fragile global infrastructure actually is. Not in a dramatic, everything collapses tomorrow way, but in a quiet, uncomfortable way where a lot of the systems we depend on are way more interconnected and vulnerable than people realize. Things like power grids, undersea internet cables, supply chains, satellite systems, financial networks, all of it is layered on top of each other, and a disruption in one place can ripple much further than expected. Most of the time it works smoothly, which creates the illusion that it's solid and resilient, but behind the scenes there are constant patches, redundancies, and contingency plans just keeping everything stable. And the part that doesn't get talked about much is how often things get close to failing. Near misses, outages, cyber incidents, infrastructure stress, all of it happens more than people think. It just usually gets resolved before it becomes visible at a global scale. So, it's not that there's some hidden doomsday scenario being kept secret, it's more that the system we rely on is more delicate than it looks. And it stays stable because of continuous effort, not because it's unbreakable, which makes it a different kind of secret. Not something hidden, but something most people never really see. Story 37. The true extent of how much of your behavior can be predicted before you even make a decision. Not in a sci-fi mind-reading way, but through patterns, data, and models that have quietly gotten very good over time. Every interaction, what you click, how long you pause, what you search, what you ignore, all of that builds a profile. And when you combine that across millions of people, systems start to recognize patterns that are surprisingly consistent. So, instead of guessing randomly, they can estimate what you're likely to do next with a level of accuracy that feels uncomfortable once you think about it. What you might buy, what content keeps you engaged, what kind of messaging you respond to, even what time of day you're more likely to make certain decisions. And the part that makes it feel like a secret isn't that it's hidden, it's that most people don't fully realize how far it's gone. Because it's not obvious. It just feels like recommendations, ads, feeds, suggestions. But underneath that, there's a layer of prediction constantly running, shaping what you see and nudging what you do without it ever feeling forced. So, it's not about control in a direct sense. It's about influence through understanding patterns. And the more data that exists, the sharper those patterns become, which means the system doesn't need to know everything about you. It just needs to know enough to be right most of the time. Story 38. How much of modern life runs on systems nobody fully understands anymore. Not in a mysterious or conspiratorial way, just in a very real, slightly unsettling way where technology and infrastructure have become so complex that no single person, or even single organization, fully grasps every part of it. Think about global financial systems, massive code bases, AI models, supply chains, even parts of the internet itself. These things are built over decades, layered by thousands or millions of contributions, patched, upgraded, expanded, and rarely rebuilt from scratch. So, what you end up with is systems that work, but are incredibly hard to fully map out or predict in every scenario. People understand pieces of them. Experts understand their domains. But the entire system as a whole is bigger than any one perspective. And that creates this weird situation where society depends heavily on things that are maintained, improved, and monitored, but not completely understood end to end. It's not that they're out of control. It's that they're too complex to be fully controlled in a simple way, which makes it a different kind of secret, not something being hidden, but something that exists in plain sight that most people don't realize is as intricate and fragile as it actually is.